morning, everyone, and welcome to the 88th episode of the Veritas fact-finding series. And today I'm joined by Miss Alissa Kole. Good morning, Alissa.
Good morning. Pleasure to join you today.
Surfacing facts and revealing truths is a never-ending quest for us at Veritas. In each episode of our fact-finding series, we go on the ground to speak to industry professionals in an unscripted, candid video format to discover how we can make better investment decisions. In this series, and with everything we do, we believe the facts empower investors and that better information leads to better investment decisions. By way of background, my name is Anthony Scilipoti, and I'm the president and CEO of Veritas, which is an independent equity research firm based in Toronto, Canada. And I'm proud to say we've celebrated over 20 years being 100% employee owned and operated. Quick note and a disclaimer, this broadcast is not to be taken as investment advice, and participants or employees of the Veritas group of companies may own securities discussed in this broadcast. While we love all our guests, this session may contain forward-looking statements, investment opinions, and comments that we do not agree with at all. Oh, imagine that. I'm not sure that could happen as we speak to Alissa. Now, Alissa, you were our guest early on as the pandemic got underway back in 2020. It was about, you were our 15th guest, so it was around April, early May of 2020. And it seems we've gone from crisis to crisis. And today we're coming back to you, given your experience and training. You were a fellow at the London School of Economics. You're former senior official at the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. We all know it as the OECD. Today, you run an advisory firm called Govern, and you've consulted with and advised numerous governments around the globe, as well as multinationals, on issues related to governance, on issues related to ESG. And that includes places like Saudi Arabia, Russia, the Baltics, Syria, you know, places that here in Western world, we don't quite understand how their economic and social structure operates, as it's different than ours. So today we're going to take a look at what's happening here in Ukraine, and I know you were born in the Ukraine, obviously speak Russian as well, and so have a very interesting take. We did provide to our viewers and clients a link to that great article you wrote about your own history with your grandparents and your own move out of Ukraine, which was very moving. It was published in the Globe a few weeks ago. Actually, it was wonderful. And but today what we're going to do is we're going to start there. And if you could give us perhaps some background on some of the interactions you've had dealing with Russia and Syria and the experience that's helped you gain. And then we'll look at the economic impacts of war. We'll talk about what you think of sanctions, what the various multinationals are doing in Russia and the impact that'll have not only on their financial statements, but perhaps on future investment decisions. Lots to go through. All right, so let's start with some experience you might share with us dealing with a number of these different governments.
Sure. Thank you, Anthony, again, for having me to talk on a subject which I personally consider very important today for reasons that are obvious. I was born in Ukraine and came to Canada when I was about 15 years old, and have subsequently lived and had the fortune to travel all over the world and working with governments in Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and many other regions. And there obviously, and I've been writing about that, not only in that particular piece that you referred to, but also in other pieces, parallels between what Russia is currently doing, or I'd rather say what Putin is currently doing in Ukraine, and what has previously happened in other conflicts all over the world. So if we look at Syria, for example, a conflict that is now very little covered in the press, for reasons that are perhaps understandable, but it's a war that was also funded and executed with strong support of Putin, and continues to be a strong supporter of Bashar al-Assad's regime. And so there are strong echoes from these various wars that have been held. And again, for those of you who have followed Russian foreign policy, there was also other interventions that Russia has, let's say, engineered in Chechnya, sort of other countries, and obviously earlier in Crimea. And just a little bit of an anecdote, I used to work at the OECD, as Anthony mentioned, and Russia applied to be a member of the OECD, which is the motto of the OECD is basically a club of like-minded states with sort of a liberal economic policy objectives and agenda. And Russia applied to be a member. It was, I mean, personally, I will say I never thought that let's say the political economy structure of the country was suited for membership, but it wasn't my decision to take. But I was responsible for reviewing the governance of Russian sort of listed companies, state-owned companies, as a sort of precursor to adhesion to the OECD. And without going into details, basically the Russia's accession to the OECD stopped when Putin invaded Crimea in 2014. And obviously Russia's participation in many international organizations has subsequently been basically stopped, frozen, or essentially forever ended. And many of these participations also highlight, I think, the current, let's say, irony of the situation when Russia is a member or a chair of the UN Human Rights Council or security. You understand that things have gone sort of terribly wrong.
Yeah, for sure. So let's start with the economic impact that this war is having.
Absolutely. So, I mean, there are a couple of numbers or sort of estimates that have been put forth, some by President Zelensky, so Ukrainian president, talking about sort of thousands of missiles being unleashed. Some cities in Ukraine basically leveled. Mariupol has about 80%, 80, of buildings, largely civilian infrastructure basically leveled to the ground. There's currently 1 and 2 Ukrainian businesses that have been shut down completely. The other half have been forced to basically operate beyond capacity. Some numbers, just to give you kind of figures, obviously Ukraine is already getting 1.5 or 1.4 billion IMF program. There's been an enormous impact on the Russian economy as well, with obviously you've seen photos from many brands and multinational companies pulling out of Russia. There's about, I think currently about 400 that pledged to either leave or scale down. Nestle, for example, is one example that is sort of scaling down because they also produce food stuff and other kind of basic food supplies, and others, around 80 of them are companies are staying on the ground. It's also very interesting to watch, I mean, and just kind of share a personal anecdote, companies like McDonald's leaving Russia. So when I was a teenager, McDonald's actually was one of the first companies that came even before Soviet Union fell, if I remember it correctly, and installed sort of its shops in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and other cities. And at the time, going to McDonald's for somebody who was born in the Soviet regime with no restaurants, no bars, and this one sort of Western outlet was a highlight, frankly, of my childhood. Strange as it is to say now. And I think McDonald's leaving, or seeing the images of McDonald's leave Russia today, is not only an economic sort of message, but it's also a message of sort of 20 years of unraveling since the Berlin Wall has fell, and basically the world that Putin is trying to recreate, his vision of reunited the grand Soviet empire, and his political vision, which very much is that we should be aware of it.
So the West has responded with sanctions, unlike I think we've ever seen before at this scale. Perhaps you could walk us through some of those sanctions and their impact.
Sure. So in fact, there's been quite a bit of talk about sanctions. I think we should preface it on looking at sanctions kind of worldwide. Where have sanctions been used as a tool? And they basically date back to ancient Greece and Napoleon times. But if we look at sort of obviously more recent history, where sanctions have been used, we're talking about countries like North Korea, we're talking about Venezuela, we're talking about Cuba, we're also talking about Iraq. Iraq was obviously facing sanctions after its invasion of Kuwait in the 90s, and until basically disposal of Saddam's regime. And the evidence by and large shows, I mean, this is not my view, it's sort of researched fact, that sanctions are not effective if we're to say that effectiveness is overturn of the regime. So if we look at Iraq, UN estimates were something like 1/3 of Iraqi children were malnourished by the end of Saddam's regime, but he was still there. When we look at North Korea has developed, as we all know, one of the most effective or sort of feared nuclear programs in the world, and yet, its people are starving. So when we think about sanctions, I think it's fair to say it's not a world where we could say they have been effective. Again, if the objective is to say we're looking for political change, which I think we all agree in this case, we are. And so when we look at specifically what has happened in Russia, I think that the response has been a bit slow at the beginning. When we think about sort of the willingness of European leaders to sort of stand up immediately and say we're willing to impose tight sanctions or strict sanctions, it is unprecedented from one point of view. It is insufficient from another, and it sort of depends on how you look at it. So what we've seen is, for example, actions like the banning or stopping access of, I think it's 7 or so Russian banks from the SWIFT system. So when we look at things like that, it's interesting to go in the detail, because when you read the headline, we know Russian banks are banned from SWIFT, but what does it actually mean? So 2 of the largest institutions, which is Sberbank and Gazprom Bank, are not subject to those sanctions. So it's effectively outside of the scope of the framework. So if you had a bank account in Russia today, you basically could just transfer your assets from one bank to the other. And secondly, the implementation deadline that was given, it's not that it was overnight, meaning that people were warned, and the sanctions, or the SWIFT sanctions at least, are only coming to force sort of now in the last, I don't remember, like last two days. So effectively, in the first 20 days of the war, Russian banks have had access to SWIFT. In terms of freezing of assets and whatnot, also a big debate. Yes, assets of Putin and oligarchs have been frozen. Great. My personal guess is that they were quite expecting for this to occur, and have probably moved their personal assets to places where they cannot be frozen, like London and other places. So I'm not so sure about the effectiveness of that measure as well. And then there's, of course, a broader debate as to who the sanctions, or how wide the sanctions should go. Meaning, shall we just focus on the Putin plus clique, or shall we focus on the broader sort of Russian population? With the idea that, of course, if you go for the broader Russian population, you're looking to stimulate demonstrations or protests that would, let's say, result in overturn of the regime. Well, first of all, looking at images, if you follow or you look at the images from the streets of Moscow, where basically the police have arrested an 18-year-old grandmother for protesting against the war, you kind of get the idea that maybe that's not so effective. There are big question marks. On the one hand, I think if you look at it from a point of view of motivating political change, you need to hit the entire population. The entire population needs to know. Also, because half of the population currently supports, actually till this day, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, simply because the news is not allowed to report on it. So half of the population, hard it is for us to imagine, is still unaware that Russian soldiers are killing people, Russian-speaking population, in a neighboring country of people who look exactly like them. And so I guess the point is to say that, yes, they're not fair if incurred for the entire population, because we're basically making the entire country of 140 million or so people pay for something that 1 or 2 people have decided. On the other hand, what are the choices? What are the choices being left if we don't?
So we now, you say, so evidence shows that the sanctions don't work. I think you could also take it to the idea that in these regimes, you have governments that are essentially have absolute power. So if we were to think about Canada, if all of a sudden Canada received the same level of sanctions that the Russian population would receive, the riots here would be, you think that it was bad when there was truckers. We're talking about there'd be mass riots everywhere, wondering where's the bread? What do you mean I can't get on my bank account? All this kind of stuff, because everything's open and the power is to the individual. But when the power is to the government, it becomes much different. And I think that's a big difference that means that we have to act in a different way if we're going to get anywhere with this war. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, the truth is, again, facts on the ground. People don't know, and I read Russian, so I've just gone to look at some of the Russian newspapers. Some of the things they say, it's not a question of debate or disagreement on topics, it's just outright lies. So when the first few days of the revolution, they said that the president had fled the country and they're conducting this war from elsewhere. All the statements, obviously, around the Nazism of the Ukrainian regime are quite laughable. So I think that, obviously there is unfairness in the whole approach of hitting the entire country. At the same time, I think the question is, what else is there to do? The answer to that is basically shooting down Russian planes in the Ukrainian sky, which means opening up possibility for World War III. So military intervention in Ukraine. So sanctions are not fair, yes, but I think, basically the last sort of imperfect tool that's left in the quote unquote diplomatic box, though I'm personally not a believer that diplomacy works with people like Putin, because I think the bullying aspect will not quite work.
Yeah, this is kind of like, you got to understand the art of war. You're dealing here with a bully who has absolute power. So you can't rise up revolution internally. Let's shift the discussion a little bit to ESG and governance. And we're seeing things like, I read that Ernst & Young pulled out. I'm reading about Deutsche Bank and what they've done. And you mentioned McDonald's. I read the article about McDonald's that the Russian government is going to take over those stores and change the logo, turn the M on its side, and leave the golden arches a little bit side. It's going to be like translated grandma or aunt something, the name. Anyway, what do you think of these companies deciding that they're going to just abandon Russia?
Well, I mean, so a couple of points on that. First, there has been, and that's an impressive story, I think, out of this war, is there has been a very swift reaction of exodus of brands. And a little bit at the beginning, there was a hesitation, like, for example, even here in Italy, I said, well, we don't want to have full level of sanctions because basically then, the Pradas of this world will pay. And then, we buckled. And so people like Renzi, who used to be on the boards of some prominent Russian companies, he said, okay, ciao. The former Finnish prime minister said the same. Others, and there are a few of them, but suffice to mention, for example, Gerhard Schroeder hasn't taken that position. So he stayed on the boards of some companies in Russia, though his entire staff, or basically most of his staff, has resigned on account of the decision. So in general, what we're seeing is, of course, exodus on one hand of board members in Russian companies. So and some even industry associations. So, for example, the UK Institute of Directors had issued a statement basically telling their members to leave boards of Russian and Belarusian companies, because Belarus is obviously considered one of Putin's fiefdoms for reasons. So on one hand, exodus of board members, on the other hand, exodus of companies. Now, to your point about what will happen to these companies, and Putin had made kind of a statement already that they will allow the nationalization of firms owned at 25% or more by foreigners from unfriendly states. We can assume that pretty much everyone falls into that category.
Yes.
And by the way, there are measures also already existing and applicable to Russian nationals living abroad and owning property, whereby it allows some mechanisms for confiscation by the state. Is he capable of doing it? I think the answer is clearly yes. And the reason, and we have reasons and facts and examples that we can point to before where this was actually already done by Russia. So, for example, I don't know how many of you have followed the very famous case of Bill Browder, who was a very prominent entrepreneur in Russia, who once had the...
I have the book.
You have the book. Okay. Well, I've spoken to Bill actually when I was working at the OECD, because we were doing this review of Russia. And it was obviously a case to consider because it was a classic corporate governance fiasco case. Basically, the man owned, I don't remember the size of his companies, but we're talking about a major oligarch or somebody who owned sort of like, I wouldn't call him oligarch, but who owned serious assets in Russia. He once made some politically inconvenient statements. He showed up in the Moscow airport, his passport was revoked, and the company was transferred, the company seal was taken and basically used to transfer the company to some random woman with no background out in some province. So it was clear that, that woman had nothing to do with the decline of Bill Browder and the loss of all his assets. Nonetheless, he lost all the assets and he launched a long legal fight that landed his lawyer by the name of Magnitsky, another sad story, in prison, where he was killed by the Russian state. And after that, the bill lobbied the American Congress to introduce a bill called the Magnitsky Act in 2016, which allows the US to sanction specific individuals for human rights abuses. So if we look at that example, it clearly tells us that nationalization, I mean, in this very particular way, was possible and can be done again. In particular, considering that the Central Bank of Russia is bleeding money because its reserves in Western countries have been basically confiscated. So Putin will definitely not hesitate at all to say, okay, well, we just take these assets and transfer them to some colleagues of mine that are currently losing money, because obviously Russian oligarchs are exposed to huge losses domestically through stock exchange, which is, by the way, dormant. And so they haven't fully experienced the extent.
Sorry, yeah, they've closed, they've shut it down.
They closed.
So you can't actually see what the price is.
Exactly. So the stock exchange is one example of sort of where we haven't seen the full extent of losses, but which is also an interesting thing to look at, because I worked with MySex before. It's one area where we know that, for example, that's not an avenue where pressure economically can be exercised, because MySex only has about 10% foreign ownership. Most of it is not by institutional investors who will intervene. It's by companies that have investments. And so again, putting sanctions on the stock exchange, or, as Americans have done, for example, with Chinese companies listed in the US more recently, is not an avenue that you can explore. So the options that are being explored are the ones that are sort of, let's say, available on the table. And to answer your question, Anthony, will Putin nationalize? Absolutely, he will. He has a sovereign wealth fund called Разимущество, to which he can potentially transfer some of these assets. He also has the oligarchs that need to be fed because they've been losing a lot, and to keep them happy, it would be nice to give them some assets that are stranded.
So let's say that eventually the Ukrainian government, acquiesces, gives up some of the regions that Russia says that they want, agrees not to join NATO, etc. Let's just move to, that's what's been tabled now among a few other key things, but those are the big strokes. What do you think happens? Do these businesses go right back in to look after, with going back for driving profits, or is that now going to be impossible?
So a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, on the scenarios. So what could happen as a result of this conflict? I mean, obviously, I mean, I'm not a military expert, so I have no crystal ball on that. That said, if you look at, for example, today's FT, I mean, there was an article by Gideon Ruckman who talked about, let's say, 3 scenarios and the probability of each one. Yep. So scenario 1 is effectively, this continues to be a long and disastrous war. Unfortunately, I'm more in that view, given the sheer force unleashed by Putin and the fact that he's not getting to his objectives. He cannot go home with the tail between his legs and say, well, this was a military blunder, we made a mistake. This is not going to happen. So he has to come home, as they say in French, entre guillemets, victorious. And so that victory is something that will take him time. And I think that he will, personally, I don't believe that he will just take away, these 2 separatist regions and Crimea and consider that a happy story. I think he will go for more. And if you look at, for example, my hometown, Odessa, I think it's on his list, on his shopping list to take, except, nobody will give it to him. So I think we're kind of in a scenario, in my mind, unfortunately, of kind of a longer term, drawn out conflict that will be very expensive. Sad it is to say. There could be other scenarios, basically where he's taken out locally, and as Gideon Ruckman said, that would be the happy scenario, to which he ascribes about 10%, and I tend to agree, not likely. And other scenarios that you mentioned, what happens if this ends somehow? Well, the question is also how.
Yeah.
If there is an agreement, so Ukraine will give up the NATO ambitions. That's not a problem. I think it's already been kind of said, or publicly or not. It might give up a little bit of the territory, but I don't think it will give up what Putin wants. So he needs to, how that will be squared, we don't know. What will happen with but we do know, by the way, sorry, but we do know what he's capable of if you look at what he's done in Syria. And we haven't come to unfortunately, and it pains me to say it, we haven't come to the end of it. We haven't come to the cluster bombs and all the dirty military tactics that Russians have used to wipe out the population of Aleppo. So if we look at what's been done and the extent of damage and the extent of cruelty that he's capable of, he hasn't fully unleashed it, even though it's hard to believe looking at images of cities in Ukraine. So for that reason, I'm not a huge believer of short-term resolution. At the same time, to answer the second part of your question, what will happen to the companies? I honestly don't think that they could be coming back to sort of in the short term for the reasons that I just outlined. But will they come back in the long term? I think likely yes, because even in war, people make money. The Halliburtons of this world make money. Other companies make money, and I have worked a lot, and I have a lot of friends in Lebanon, another country that has seen 15 years of civil war. And yes. If you look at the incredible political dreadlock and basically the state of corruption and whatnot, you also see the impact of long-term warfare, and in the longer term, even in peaceful times. So it becomes a political economy game of who gets what and how these assets get distributed. So when we look at the fall of the Soviet Union, the assets got distributed, the state-owned companies, to the various oligarchs. There was a lot of corruption, and then we have the current structure of the Russian political regime or elite. What will happen in the future could be another sort of redistribution of nationalized assets to Putin's supporters in Russia. And yes, in the long term, I do believe that, of course, Western investors and brands will go back to make money in Russia as they do in other parts of the world where the human rights record is far from rosy.
Yeah. So does that really then, I just read today in the paper, Ian de Vertai, who I know well, he did a paper there. He's at CIBC now, and and I'm sorry, I think it's BMO. Anyway, but doesn't matter. Did a piece looking at some of these ESG funds, and they had 2 times or some multiple times the investment in Russian and assets. Let's call them, or they were mainly oil and gas, versus their investment in Canadian oil and gas entities. And yet, they did that because there's, our Canadian oil, we won't get into a whole discussion, but because of oil sands, this concept of us producing more carbons, which I think is not correct. But besides that, then instead they're investing in places like Russia, where I'm not sure that people are paying attention to the S and of course the G. So what's going on with this whole ESG? Because I'm on an advisory board to the International Accounting Standards Board, and they're talking about starting the sustainability board with a whole bunch of new standards. I'm sure you're aware and have been advising also. So where are we going with this? Are we losing our way?
So I think a couple of comments. First on this whole kind of concept of looking for returns in emerging markets. I mean, I think that it's something that, if we look back and kind of trace back, go back to this very much cited acronym of BRICS that was coined by I think a Goldman Sachs economist, Jim O'Neill. It was more than 20 years ago now. Of course, we were looking at Russia, we were looking at Brazil, we were looking at China, and investors were looking at these countries with a lot of hope, a lot of expectations. I think in Russia, but not only in Russia, also in China, if you look at the current scandal or the spat between the US and Chinese administrations and the various levels of regulatory punishment, let's call them for now, that have been levied against by the American administration against US listed Chinese companies, we also see that, this whole love affair is proving a bit delicate, and a number of institutional investors have gotten their fingers burned, not only in Russia, but also China. And China today accounts for something like 33% of the MSCI emerging market index, right? So we're not talking peanuts. And so I think that, my reading, I mean, and I'd be curious to hear your views on this too, is that investors are starting to say, okay, we have some issues with basically every one of the BRICS. The Petrobras story in a few months ago, I interviewed the securities regulator on my channel called Governance Dialogues, a YouTube channel which I launched to talk about these issues.
Yes,
it's a fascinating case study. China currently, I've been writing a lot about the capital market implications or the outcomes of this sort of political tensions between the United States and China. I think we haven't come to the end of it, and the act that will actually start delisting Chinese companies from the US markets hasn't fully taken effect. So they will started getting delisted in 2024. So I think a lot of questions are being asked about this sort of search for return, or you mentioned instead of investing in a Canadian oil company, we're going to go and invest in Russia. That said, I personally, and I would probably think it's an unconventional view, don't think that it falls into this whole ESG mantra. And I'll tell you why. I think that, somewhere in this process of talking about ESG, which was basically like BRICS used to be before, has become the sexiest acronym in any financial newspaper. Yep. We've leaved so much responsibility on these investors that they're basically carrying today boards, responsibilities that are way beyond what a corporate board should carry. So, war in Ukraine, yes, of course, it has supply chain implications and all kinds of risks that board have a fiduciary and a kind of a responsibility to manage. But is it the responsibility of a board of a company to make sure that they don't have investments in all these countries that could potentially become war zones? I'm not so sure that it's a feasible expectations. Also because you have to be realistic, and I think perhaps the only person who writes the truth about this subject is a Harvard professor called Lucian Bebchuk, who talks about this whole how we've blown up this ESG phenomenon completely out of proportion, but also completely out of reality, and the fact that we expect so much. So I think in this particular case, we're in a playground where it's clearly government playground. So governments need to take sanctions, shoot helicopters, whatever it is that they need to do. But I think expecting boards to take some of these decisions is not realistic, because ultimately some of these decisions also, I mean, evidently put in line interests of shareholders. So you're basically asking the board to say, okay, either we write off a whole bunch of these assets and our share price drops, our profit drops, et cetera, or we protect the safety of Ukrainian children. Well, that's not their fiduciary responsibility. It's maybe their human responsibility. We can argue about that, but I think that there is a misplacement, if I may say so, of responsibility. So yes, political risk is a board risk. So when you decide to operate in country X and you know that you're not subject to Canadian quality human rights and whatever other legal framework, you're taking a risk. So, you bite the bullet when you're hit with it. At the same time, saying, you should only operate in these clean jurisdictions, I'm not so sure it's fully the board responsibility. I think dealing with the consequences of these types of situations is a government responsibility.
It's very interesting because there's a lot of work being written about this. Have you ever spoken to or dealt with Peter Day here in Canada?
Yes, of course. Peter, yeah, I've met him in, I think it's Saudi Arabia, actually.
Is that? No, I believe it. So I had Peter Day on our one of our sessions. Wonderful speaker, fantastic, interesting perspective. But he talks about the holistic, governance of the board, and how is it just for shareholder returns, or should we start measuring, returns in other measures related to social governance, etc. And it's a big challenge. And as you said, maybe this is, I guess I would say, almost a litmus test for all of this ESG thought.
Perhaps, but I think COVID was in a way also a litmus test for it. And,
sure,
we've gone from a situation where, the one positive development of this thing is Putin has killed COVID as well.
Well, I think what's going to ultimately bring all the ESG thought to the fore is when investors look at the returns on their ESG funds and start saying, well, wait a minute, you're saving the world, but are you even saving the world? And I'm actually not making a return. And so that's going to be difficult at the end of the day to evaluate and tell to your unit holders or your pensioners, yeah, we have this great ESG score, but what about our returns, right?
Exactly. And I think that a very interesting example to look at when we think about this is Norges, which is Norway's sovereign wealth fund.
They've been very vocal, and they actually changed their stance, but tell us.
Yes. So I mean, anyone who follows Norges knows that first of all, they changed the management team recently. They're now run by, I think, a former hedge fund or like sort of gentleman. But anyways, Norges has divested from coal and other assets, which was a very controversial decision because they're actually profitable assets. Yep. It went through parliamentary debate. I mean, this is a whole kind of and it shows the complexities of these decisions. Yes, we are in many situations in some cases in alignment of environmental and financial objectives, and people like John Lukomnik write about the triple bottom line and the kind of the coherence between these objectives in the long term for all investors as a whole. Yep. But I'm not so sure personally that there is always that coherence, and sometimes it requires taking painful decisions like Norges did and said, okay, we don't want to be investing in coal because we just don't want to be a part of that game. Other investors, like in the Muslim world, they would say we don't invest in pork, prostitution, et cetera, et cetera. So like they have a different mentality, and they will abstain from investing in these things. Though in the assets, though they could be profitable. So it can be a contradiction, and I think that we ought to have an honest debate about it, as opposed to saying, yes, these are all mutually reinforcing mutually sort of reinforcing objectives. And in this case, we'll see that when Western brands will have to write off the Russian operations, it will not be mutually reinforcing at all.
So in the interest here of time, and I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to ask a question. We did receive one question. If anyone has a question, you just hover down to your Q&A logo and just type in your question. I'll make sure to ask Alissa the question. So we have our first question. It's a real good one. But what's your opinion on the Russian index? Do you think that they're going to open up the market?
Not soon, is my guess. I mean, not soon. As I said, they don't have much foreign investment, so it's not that foreign investors will crash the market. So if we look at some markets, for example, Turkey is a great example. Turkey used to be invested up to about half by foreigners, institutional investors, some retailers, but obviously a large part institutional investors. And so as a response to some political developments that we won't go into detail in this talk, a lot of investors have left Turkey, and that has an impact on the market. In Russia, we will not see this because it's frankly not a foreign invested market to begin with. Of course, but in the current circumstances, I don't see it opening because basically the value of all the local companies will just tank. And, short of them playing with some sort of circuit breaker mechanisms and, whatnot. And I don't even see the point of that in the current situation because it's not a temporary thing. It's not that you need a circuit breaker for a few hours of trading. You need a circuit breaker until Putin basically leaves Ukraine.
Yeah. Okay. And that goes back to our initial point out at the beginning where we talked about, when you have absolute power, who's going to question their not being able to access their stocks? I'm just going to launch here our poll so everyone can tell us what a great job Alissa did and give us some advice on other things we should cover. When I, ultimately looking at at where we are, what do you, and obviously we did touch on the different scenarios. And if you look at those scenarios, what do you think the most likely outcome is of the current war?
You mean in terms of outcomes politically between Ukraine
politically, economically, yeah.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not on the. I really wish I could say something more positive. And yesterday, I was actually at a talk given by a very famous war correspondent, Janine De Giovanni, and she's written a lot of books about different conflicts in Syria and in Africa, and also Putin's invasion of Chechnya. I mean, if we look at his illustrious history, he hasn't walked away from things from any of these conflicts without gains, and he's maintained sort of strong relationships with the Bashar al-Assad's regime and continues to support him. So I don't personally, as much as it pains me to say it, see a fast resolution to this because he needs to come back home victorious. I also don't see that he can be in any way disposed short of, again, like a palace intrigue. But given the paranoia around him, if you look at public appearances, I mean, it's not just the French president, but even his own military generals that meet him across a 25-meter table. So I think, unfortunately, he's not gone, and he won't leave. He won't leave without a victory. I think it's a huge miscalculation because he thought that he would be greeted well in Ukraine. But now I think we're at a status quo where this sort of lower intensity warfare, and as we've seen in Iraq and other places, unfortunately, even war can become banal. So will the newspapers continue covering it in 1 month's time or 2 months' time when he continues shelling Kiev? I don't know.
That's interesting. And therefore, as far as the economic impacts, it could be sustained and continue to be painful.
Yes, I mean, well, there are two things. First, he's leveled out Ukrainian economy, and we know how this works, like in history. So, obviously the IMF, the EBRDs, the World Banks of this world will come running and start rebuilding and lending for infrastructure that didn't need to be rebuilt in the first place, but has been completely leveled. All bridges have been blown up around Kiev to prevent Russian tanks from entering. entire cities have been taken out. So I mean, the cost on the Ukrainian side is, I don't think anyone can count it, and if they tell you that they can, it would be a lie. The cost for the Russian economy, I think nobody knows, and I think that contrary to common perceptions, it was a very premeditated war. I mean, if you look at sort of the debt to GDP ratio of Russia, it's nothing like the American debt to GDP ratio. They were ready for it. So yeah, we've seized their reserves. We've maybe introduced some measures around SWIFT and whatnot. But these are painful sanctions in the long term. They're not as painful as they need to be, unfortunately, in the short term. So now, yeah, there are some scenes from Russian supermarkets where there is no more sugar, there's no more toilet paper. But to get to a point where it's the water boils and the frog jumps, there really has to be no toilet paper and no sugar.
And the belief that no more is coming. That's the other thing. Because of the massive control over media, he can sway the public opinion. And even those that are in the know, my understanding in talking to people that have lived in Russia, like yourself, that if you're in the know, and let's say you decide, you're a doctor or lawyer and you have Western contacts and so forth, so kind of what's really happening. If you protest or decide to go against the government just takes away your license. Says, okay, yeah, now you're done. You can't act in the way you were trained to do.
Essentially, I mean, they've closed down all independent medias. There were a couple of that actually even paraded, like as you saw, there was this woman who was brave enough to go in public and say this war is a lie on a major Russian state-controlled channel. So she's in for a long and painful court battle. So I mean, I think that obviously the Russian population, the people who don't have access to the wild world, and we have to understand that they don't know what's going on.
So again, another great question. Do you believe there's a point that NATO will decide to act before Putin moves beyond Ukraine? Coming to us all the way from Nova Scotia here. Thanks, Leo. Thank you
for hello to Nova Scotia. I don't. I mean, if you listened to statements of the Secretary General of NATO, he even kind of said once something like, when there was a bomb that exploded 20 kilometers from Poland's border, he said, well, military blunders can be made. So NATO obviously does not want to get involved in this war. If they wanted to, they had, I think, ample opportunity to do so in the last 25 days, right? So it's clear that they don't. I think obviously the Latvias and the sort of the former Soviet republics that were previously annexed to the Soviet Union are fully aware of what KGB is capable of doing, and Putin is KGB. So they're freaking out for good reason. And I think, if he crosses that line, I think NATO, I mean, legally has to intervene, right? So then it becomes a different situation. To tell you the truth, I'm not sure which one of the two scenarios I prefer, because if NATO goes into this war, we are in a really third World War III scenario. If we don't intervene into this war, Putin has absolute impunity in leveling Ukraine as he did with Syria. So it's not a world of great options.
And then the question becomes, if Russia can do that in Ukraine, does China go to Taiwan?
Of course.
Do other Middle Eastern countries that don't like other Middle Eastern countries start to take action, etc.?
Yes, that too.
So anyway, thank you for your time, your insight, and views today. Stay strong. We will definitely stay in touch and keep discussing this hopefully short-lived situation.
Amen.
Amen. Okay, we'll leave on that note. Thanks, everyone. Stay strong.
Thank you.